Good evening, Bern, and welcome along to the Lodge Hope of Karachi, number 337, and our lockdown lecture series. It's a great pleasure to have you all along here this evening on what is a lovely evening here in the Kingdom of Fife. And as ever, Bern, to start with, can I remind you of the Grand Lodge of Scotland guidelines in terms of our Zoom meetings? Please keep your camera on and a recognisable name in the screen. Can I ask you all at this time or later on this evening to sign the virtual tile within our Facebook pages, please? I do bring apologies from our acting secretary and immediate past master. He's got a family commitment this evening and flying the desk solo, so to speak. But we do like to give them something to do throughout the day during lockdown and record everyone's names. At this time, Bern, I think it's only fitting and appropriate that I share my screen and we pay I'm not going to share my screen because it's not working, but I think it's only fitting that we pay tribute to Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh. And I'm going to pay a small tribute to him that was prepared by Brother Captain David Swain, the Grand Secretary of the Metropolitan Grand Lodge in London. Captain Swain is a naval man himself. Bern. Prince Philip was born in Greece into the Greek and Danish royal families. His family was exiled from the country when he was an infant. After being educated in France, Germany, and the United Kingdom, he joined the British Royal Navy in 1939, age 18. After the war, Philip was granted permission by George VI to marry Elizabeth. Before the official announcement of their engagement in July 1947, he abandoned his Greek and Danish royal titles and became a naturalised British subject, adopting the surname Mountbatten from his maternal grandparents. He married Elizabeth on the 20th of November 1947. Just before the wedding, he was created Duke of Edinburgh. He retired from his royal duties on the 2nd of August 2017 at the age of 96, having completed 22,219 solo engagements since 1952. Prince Philip was proposed into Freemasonry by instructor Rear Admiral Sir Arthur Hall, KBE, CB, PGD, a previous Worshipful Deputy Master of Navy Lodge and honorary member of United Service Lodge. His seconder was Admiral of the Fleet, Baron Fraser of North Cape. He was initiated into Navy Lodge on the 5th of December 1952 at an emergency meeting held in Freemasons Hall, when no private guests were allowed. There were 52 lodge members present and just 12 official guests, including the Most Worshipful Grand Master, the Earl of Scarborough. Prince Philip was passed on the 6th of March and raised on the 4th of May 1953, with the Most Worshipful Grand Master present and the Most Worshipful Grand Master Mason of Scotland in attendance. On this occasion, 21 officers of Navy Lodge were joined by 69 members, 42 official guests and 85 other guests. Though he had not played an active role in the Lodge, he remained a member and was recognised in 2002 as a 50-year Mason. Prince Philip passed to the Grand Lodge above on the 9th of April 2021. He lived respected and died regretted. Brian, can I ask you to bow your heads for a few minutes silence in memory of Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Brian. I felt that was just fitting that we should remember the service that the Duke of Edinburgh has given to our nation at the lockdown lecture meeting during this period of national mourning. Thank you so much, Brian. Brian, moving on to our daily advancement, it's a great pleasure for me to welcome Brother Robert Marshall, all the way from Texas, Brian. He's come to give us a story of Freemasonry and its connection to the Alamo. Brother Robert, if you could please unmute yourself, and you will be able to share your screen, and the virtual floor is now over to you, sir.
Thank you, Brother Gordon, and thank you everybody for having me here today. I'm excited to be with you. As far as sharing my screen goes, I don't know if that's already happening because I'm talking. I hope you're seeing me. Maybe I can get a few head nods.
Yeah, we can see you. Yeah.
Okay, good deal. So I was surprised, but positively surprised when I received a message asking if I'd be interested in sharing about Freemasonry at the Alamo with a lodge in Scotland. I've met a few Scottish brothers in my time as a Mason. I've met Bob Cooper, but then I guess who hasn't at this point, as well as oh gosh, I can think James, and I can't think of his last name. He comes to Kansas pretty frequently, where I'm also an active
James
Mason.
Jack.
Thank you, James Jack. And I've always enjoyed chatting with brothers from Scotland about what Masonry's like there now, but also what it's been like in the past for obvious reasons. Unfortunately, I'm not going to have a slideshow for you. I like to do slideshows or visuals. I don't have one for this program yet. And that's mostly because I had not previously arranged a presentation specifically about Freemasonry at the Alamo. So I've got one at another famous battle of the Texas Revolution, San Jacinto, and I've got a program that's generally about Masons in the Texas Revolution who've been forgotten. But this was the first time I organized one from my files specifically about guys who are at the Alamo. So that means, unfortunately, you'll be stuck staring at my mug or whatever you decide to look at while I'm talking about the Alamo. And I guess you want me to go ahead and launch into it, or?
Yes, please, Robert, and we'll do questions and answers when you finish, if that's okay.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Please forgive me if any aspect of this presentation comes across as if I've assumed that you do or don't know something in the context of the Texas Revolution. In true Texas ego fashion, I'm prone to thinking everybody knows the story of, say, the Alamo or Sam Houston and the Runaway Scrape or whatever aspect you want to choose. But I'm also at the same time aware that that common assumption by myself and other Texans is not necessarily the case. So when we do questions and answers at the end, if there's anything you want me to clarify or more context that you'd like built around anything I talk about, feel free to ask, and I'll probably be able to provide it. If not, I'll be able to provide it in a follow-up letter to you guys, giving that context. So with that, I'll begin. To the people of Texas and all Americans throughout the world, fellow citizens and compatriots, I am besieged by 1,000 or more of the Mexicans under Santa Anna. I have sustained a continual bombardment and cannonade for 24 hours and have not lost a man. The enemy has demanded a surrender at discretion. Otherwise, the garrison are to be put to the sword if the fort is taken. I have answered the demand with a cannon shot, and our flag still waves proudly from the walls. I shall never surrender or retreat. Then I call on you in the name of liberty, of patriotism, and everything dear to the American character. Come to our aid with all dispatch. The enemy is receiving reinforcements daily and will no doubt increase to 3,000 or 4,000 in 4 or 5 days. If my call is neglected, I am determined to sustain as long as possible and die like a soldier who never forgets what is due to his own honor and that of his country. Victory or death. William Barrett Travis. 185 years on, the Battle of the Alamo still possesses a peculiar and romantic place within the psyches of Texans, Americans, and other people throughout the world. At the time, Mexico was a relatively new nation that had developed two main factions, one that thought their republic should follow the model of the United States, with power being spread across the land in local or regional capitals. The other thought Mexico required a stronger federal power with a more centralized government in order to firmly establish itself on the world stage. Interestingly for us, those factions were publicly and generally thought of as under the monikers of Yorkinos or Escocesos, your Scottish or your York Mexican politicians. Interesting rabbit hole altogether on its own that I won't take us down at this moment. It was within this tug of war about how the new government would be run in Mexico that Texas became a uniquely perfect place to settle the debate. Muddying the waters was a massive influx of immigrants from the United States living in Texas, many of them illegally, and rapidly developing communities based on their homeland. Mexican President Santa Anna saw this as a threat to Mexico's hold on the Texas region. He outlawed further immigration without certain qualifications, and coupled with the recent outlawing of slavery, these changes incensed the tensions already existing between white American settlers and Mexicans living in Texas. A variety of miniature conflicts occurred leading up to 1835 and resulted in the Texas immigrants effectively ejecting Mexican forces from the region. So these Mexican politicians, who often had small groups of military forces intended to, hold things down on the frontier, were basically kicked out of the area. This led President Santa Anna to assemble a large army and proceed to Texas with the intent of suppressing those tensions by force. The Texas settlers understandably saw it as war, and they too began to organize their own military forces. Amid all of this, on March 2nd of 1836, the Texan Declaration of Independence was produced. It effectively declared Texan independence and laid out a variety of reasons. But regardless of those, Santa Anna, the self-proclaimed Napoleon of the West, of course, could not afford to let the rest of Mexico and the world at large see him lose such a large portion of his new nation without a fight. And in fact, the fight had already begun. The Mexican army of 1,500 had arrived in San Antonio a week earlier on the afternoon of February 23rd, and the siege at the Alamo was underway. Terms for surrender and negotiations failed miserably. That night, things were mostly quiet as Mexican forces were still settling up their artilleries. But beginning February 24th, a steady bombardment of cannonballs began to rain upon the old Catholic mission where the Texans had decided to make their stand. That same day, the Texan commander James Bowie collapsed due to what was probably an advanced case of tuberculosis. The 40-year-old immigrant and slave trader from Kentucky had built an enormous reputation across the American West and become a sort of folk hero around whom great tales of fighting and adventure swirled. Bowie is believed to have been a member of Humble Cottage Lodge number 19 in Opelousas, Louisiana, a lodge that then, and even now somewhat, operated out of a French Masonic tradition, as many did in the Louisiana area. Seeing this legendary Freemason with a larger-than-life reputation to overcome all odds succumb to illness in their most desperate hour of need must have been ominous to the 200 outnumbered Texans. Bowie's co-commander, William Barrett Travis, was now alone in leadership at the age of 26. It was in this moment that he authored the defiant victory or death letter I read just a moment ago to start the program. Travis had become a Mason in Alabama, where his law office was inside the lodge building before he illegally immigrated to Texas in pursuit of land opportunities. He became involved in the early skirmishes of the Revolution after he was hired as a lawyer to locate and return runaway slaves for Louisiana acquaintance. Texas had become a safe haven for runaway slaves after Mexico's abolition of the practice. From this troubled beginning emerged a youthful and defiant leader that answered the call to help the men in the Alamo by bringing 25 other soldiers with him at the last minute. Now, with the fall of Bowie to tuberculosis, young Travis was in charge. For several days and nights, the siege went on. By March 1st, about a dozen men had died, most of them Mexican soldiers who'd been caught sneaking ever closer to the Alamo walls, usually under the darkness of night. One of Santa Anna's generals, Juan Almonte, was stationed with 800 soldiers on the road to Goliad to cut off supplies or reinforcements for the Texans. This same general would later be the one who saw the Masonic apron draped over the infant child in Susanna Dickinson's arms and leapt from his horse to take her and the babe into his protection, an inspiring story of Masonic brotherhood, sparing a freshly grieving widow after her husband was killed the night before inside the Alamo. On March 3rd, the Texans watched from the walls as approximately 1,000 Mexicans marched into San Antonio. The Mexican army celebrated loudly throughout the afternoon, as their numbers were now over 3,000 against the Texans' 200. In an act of desperation, young Travis sent 3 scouts to try to locate a group of reinforcements that the Texans had been hoping for. As an aside, this was a specific group of reinforcements led by another brother named James Fannin, who there had been an exchange of letters, and it was thought that he would be arriving any minute. A couple of days passed, he didn't show up. So they sent these 3 scouts to look for him, not knowing that most of the reinforcements had already been killed in a separate skirmish. Almost lost my place. There we go. So one of the 3 scouts that were sent to look for the reinforcements was legendary frontiersman from Tennessee, Davy Crockett, the coonskin-capped hero of many youth's imaginations even today. Perhaps no man before or since has so personified the ideal of the American spirit. Larger than life, he was known as the king of the wild frontier. When he was 13 years old, Davy Crockett's father insisted that he enroll in school. After only a few days of attendance, Crockett fought the class bully and was afraid to go back, fearing possible punishment or revenge. Instead, he ran away from home and spent more than 2 years wandering around while honing his skills as a woodsman among natives and other people. He later served in the War of 1812 and then was elected to the U.S. Congress in the 1820s. He lost a bid for re-election in 1835, and he was later reported to have announced to the voters after he lost the election, quote, "You may all go to hell, and I will go to Texas," end quote. And I think I didn't put it in here, but it's at that point that something happened, which today is the only evidence that Davy Crockett was a Mason. And what that thing is when he left Tennessee, he is believed to have left behind his Masonic apron with a friend who passed it down through their family. And it's actually not really certain that he was a Mason, because the lodge closest to his homestead there burned, like many lodges did in the 1800s, and all its records did with it. So the idea is that there were probably records to prove that he was a Mason in the building when it burned. The 2 big signs are this apron that has been passed down with provenance, as well as the fact that during and immediately after his own lifetime, there were known Freemasons who referred to him as such, which would have been unusual. Not to say that they couldn't have lied or embellished what they knew about him being a Mason, but pretty odd to have multiple leading Masons refer to a man as one if he's not. So this fiery frontiersman arrived just in time to participate in the revolution, And so it was that he, leading a band of misfits not unlike Peter Pan and the Lost Boys, rode into the Alamo as reinforcements, dressed in a lot of strange clothes from the frontier and the woodsy lifestyle they'd been leading. The scout mission, upon which he was sent to look for more reinforcements on the night of March 3rd, proved somewhat successful. After discovering several dozen men willing to join the fight, Crockett led them back to San Antonio, where the thousands of Mexican forces barred their entry to the fort until, on the morning of March 4th, he somehow managed to burst through the Mexican ranks and make his way to the Texan comrades within the mission walls. This was probably the most hopeful and inspiring moment to the Texans at the Alamo, to suddenly have a boost of around, historians disagree on the exact number, but between 50 and 80 new arrivals ready to fight with them. On the following morning, March 5th, Santa Anna announced his plan to launch a full-blown invasion of the mission, and he excused those frontline soldiers who would be in the uncomfortable position of fighting against their own family members, which absolutely was a real concern. I can tell you that it's something many Texans over time have kind of lost track of. But as with many wars, especially wars over land, there were people on both sides who were family members or even members of the same Masonic lodges in Mexico, who were now faced with the unenviable duty, so to speak, of trying to kill each other. So Santa Anna gave his frontline soldiers the opportunity to go home if they did not want to confront that possible dilemma. William Barrett Travis's intelligence was apprised of this, and something occurred that afternoon which has been the subject of great speculation. It's one of the most famous moments in Texas history, and one that I can tell you most Texans still get the chills anytime it's mentioned. Is it myth or is it fact? We do not know, but the story goes that the young commander assembled the Texans within the Alamo and explained that Santa Anna would soon launch an attack, believed to be occurring sometime within the following 24 hours. Travis then is said to have drawn a line in the sand with his sword. In line with his victory or death letter, he told the men that they could still leave if they so desired, but that if they were willing to die for Texas independence, they should cross that sword-drawn line and do so knowing that they indeed would likely be dead soon. It is said that all but one man stepped over that line, and their destiny was then apparent. That night, around 10 p.m., the Mexicans stopped firing cannonballs into the Alamo for the first time in over a week. The sudden quiet caused many of the Texans to take an opportunity for sleep, just as President Santa Anna had hoped. He divided his forces into several columns, each of which was commanded by a Mexican Freemason. It was a cold and cloudy night, which meant that movement was hard to detect, the moonlight being blocked by the clouds. They began to approach the walls at around 5 in the morning. The Texan lookouts were killed in their sleep. As the walls were reached, cries of "Viva Santa Anna" were accompanied by the trumpeting of buglers, and so the surprise was revealed. Texas women, children, and the sick gathered in the mission's chapel, crying and praying for mercy. Travis ran to the command, screaming in both English and Spanish, of which he was fluent, to his white and Tejano soldiers to man their stations and commanding them to reject any desire to surrender. Many of the Mexican soldiers outside the walls were draftees, unwillingly serving without experience. They began to fire, and many killed their own fellow soldiers in a blind fury, unaware of the mistake they were making. The tight concentration of their columns also offered an excellent target for the Texan artillery. Lacking canister shot, Texans filled their cannons with any metal they could find, including door hinges, nails, chopped up horseshoes, literally anything. And so in a practical sense, instead of thinking of it as cannons, you'd be right to think of it as more like large shotguns, right? Just firing various shrapnel. According to the diary of Mexican soldier and Freemason Jose Enrique de la Peña, quote, a single cannon volley did away with half the company of chasseurs from Toluca. So things weren't looking good for the Mexican forces as they first attempted to actually invade the Alamo fortifications. Although some in the front of the Mexican ranks wavered, soldiers in the rear pushed them forward. As the troops massed against the walls, Texans were forced to lean over the walls to shoot, leaving them exposed to Mexican fire. Travis became one of the first Alamo defenders to die. He was shot while firing his shotgun into the soldiers directly beneath him. There is a source that says he may have been using his sword to stab someone trying to come over the walls. It's a not very trustworthy source, but a popular version of the story. A few of the Mexican ladders reached the walls. The soldiers who were able to climb the ladders were quickly killed or beaten back. And as the Texans discharged their previously loaded rifles, they themselves found it increasingly difficult to reload while trying to stop the Mexican soldiers from coming over the wall. Makes sense. Mexican soldiers withdrew and regrouped. Then they tried again, but on the second try, they were again repelled. 15 minutes into the battle, they attacked a third time. So 15 minutes has passed at this point. Probably around 20, maybe a little bit more, had already died before this morning time invasion was attempted. But those numbers start racking up very fast in this 15 minutes. It was during that third strike that General and Freemason Jose Maria Romero's column, aiming for the east wall of the Alamo fortifications, was exposed to cannon fire, so he shifted to the north, which collided him with another column. Brother Martin Perfecto de Cosa's column of soldiers, probably the most famous general there that day on the Mexican side, not counting Santa Anna, of course. He fell under fire from Texans on the west side of the fortifications. So he also shifted to the north side. And when Santa Anna saw all of his columns moving towards the northern side of the mission, he panicked because he thought that the guys that were supposed to be coming from the east and west had either been wiped out or were reduced to such small numbers that he wasn't able to see them in any substantial manner. So that caused him to send reserves to where all of the remaining soldiers were. So effectively, this whole plan to attack the Alamo from all these directions collapsed within 20 minutes, and they're all moving to the north side of the Alamo. The Mexican soldiers closest to the north wall, now boosted by the entire army focusing on the same spot, realized that the wall was kind of shoddy. It had been thrown up and haphazardly very quickly. And that's because the mission was old. The Alamo was at this point a very old Catholic mission from long before Mexico had ever even thought about independence, let alone Texas. So the fort, as it's often referred to in Texas, this mission had collapsing walls when they got there, but walls nonetheless, and they fortified them as best they could. It turned out to not be good enough, and when the Mexican forces noticed that that northern wall was pretty weak, they realized that they could damage it in such a way that would create gaps or toeholds or places where they could actually reach in and grab and climb on. And so that's the in media res strategy that kind of changed the direction of the battle. Whereas they'd been getting pushed back and pushed back, now they figure out they've found a weak wall where they can actually turn the wall itself into a ladder for breaching. One of the first to scale the 12-foot wall was General, and again a Freemason, Juan Amador. At his challenge, his men began swarming up the wall. Amador opened the north wall and allowed Mexican soldiers to pour into the complex. So they're in now. The gig is up at this point. Texan soldiers knew it would happen. They didn't know how it was going to happen, but they expected to die. And now the Mexican soldiers are walking right into the mission. Others climbed through gun holes in the west wall. And as the Texan defenders abandoned the north wall and the northern end of the west wall, Texan gunners at the south end of the mission turned their cannons northward and fired into the advancing Mexican soldiers. This left the south end of the mission unprotected entirely, and within minutes, Mexican soldiers had climbed the walls, killed the gunners, and gained control of the Alamo's cannons. By this time, Brother Romero's men had taken the east wall of the compound, and they too were pouring in, but they were coming in through the cattle pen where the livestock was kept. As previously planned, most of the Texan defenders fell back to the barracks and the chapel itself. Holes had been carved in the walls to allow the Texans to fire from the barracks, and some of them, unable to reach the barracks, stationed along the west wall, started moving westward for the San Antonio River. Are they planning to flee outright, or are they planning to try to circle back around and attack the Mexicans from the backside? Hard to say. But when the cavalry charged, those Texan defenders took cover and hid in a ditch, from which they are believed to have actually been somewhat effective for a few minutes before they were overrun and killed. The defenders, or sorry, the Mexican soldiers coming into the cattle pen also made it into the horse corral, and after discharging their weapons, the small band of Texas defenders scrambled over the low wall, circled behind the church, and raced on foot for the East Prairie. So now you've got Texans coming out from the west side and the east side. But on the east side, they actually were more hopeful, because when they came out on the west side, there were still some Mexican soldiers trying to overcome the walls on that side. But on the east side, remember how I talked about the Mexican forces had shifted? Well, the ones coming from the east had entirely shifted north, and then even some of them to the west, to the point that when the Texans coming out of the east side running looked ahead of themselves, they saw wide open pasture. They thought they were going to get away. The Mexican cavalry circled them as they moved into the open pasture. Brother Almiron Dickinson and his Texan artillery crew turned a cannon around and fired into that Mexican cavalry. But nevertheless, all of the escaping Texans were killed. There may have been a very small number that escaped. That actually has been repeatedly debated by historians over time. But generally, it was a total loss. The last Texan group to remain in the open, almost poetically, it couldn't have been written with any more dramatic climax, were Davy Crockett and his band of misfits defending the lower wall in front of the actual chapel or church building itself inside the mission. Unable to reload quickly enough, they began to use their rifles as clubs, swinging them and hitting the Mexican soldiers, and they were also fighting with knives. After a volley of fire and a wave of Mexican bayonets, the few remaining Texans in this group fell back towards the church. The Mexican army now controlled all of the outer walls and the interior of the Alamo compound, except for the church and rooms along the east and west side. Mexican soldiers turned their attention to a Texan flag waving from the roof of one building. 4 Mexicans were killed before the flag of Mexico was raised in that location. For the next hour, the Mexican army worked to secure complete control of the Alamo grounds. Many of the remaining occupiers were ensconced in the fortified barracks rooms. Remember, that was kind of the this is where we're going to go when things get bad location. So that was where the Texans expected to make their last stand. In the confusion, the Texans had neglected to spike their cannon before retreating, so Mexican soldiers were able to turn the cannon towards the barracks. So their plan backfired, literally. As each door was blown off, Mexican soldiers would fire a volley of muskets into the dark room before they could see anything, and then charge in for hand-to-hand combat. And it is believed that some women and children were killed amid that confusion. Too sick to participate in the battle himself. Remember, Jim Bowie, one of the commanders, had fallen sick with tuberculosis before things really got underway. It's thought that he probably died in bed, where a combination of Tejanos, Anglos, and even black slaves had all been trying to care for him medically to no avail. Nobody actually knew what was wrong with him. It's only believed after a great deal of time that it was probably tuberculosis. Some witnesses maintained that they saw several Mexican soldiers enter his room, bayonet him, and carry him alive from it. Others claimed that he shot himself or was killed by soldiers while too weak to lift his head. And there is a historian who has shared what has become the most popular version. You'll see it in the films. I know somebody mentioned at least one of the films before the program started, of him propped up against a wall with his pistols and, of course, his famous Bowie-style knife, defending himself to the last breath. The last of the Texans to die were the 11 men who were manning a pair of cannons in the church building. A shot from the 18-pounder cannon destroyed the barricades at the front of the church, and the Mexican soldiers entered it after firing an initial musket volley. Again, amid smoke and darkness, they're basically just firing a bunch of musket balls into who knows what, and then they enter. Brother Dickinson's crew fired their cannon from the apse into the Mexican soldiers at the door. Uh-oh, where do we go here? Here we go. Then after he had fired that load, he didn't have time to reload. And the Texans, including him, Gregorio Esparza, and James Bonham, also a Freemason, grabbed rifles and fired before being bayoneted to death. A great number of the Texans inside the walls died by bayonet. Texan soldier Robert Evans had been tasked with keeping the gunpowder from falling into Mexican hands, and wounded, he literally crawled toward the ammunitions, but he was killed by a musket ball with his torch in his hand, just very, very near the powder. He was planning to blow it up. If he had been able to, it's believed that he probably also would have blown up the church as well as all of the women and children inside it. As soldiers approached the church building, one of the young sons of Anthony Wolfe stood to pull a blanket over his shoulders. And in the dark, as I said, amid a lot of confusion, the Mexican soldiers couldn't tell who he was or what he was, so they shot and killed him through the blanket. Possibly the last Texan to die in battle was young Jacob Walker, who I should have put here. I think off the top of my head, I want to say he was around 30 years old. He may have been a little bit younger than that. He ran into the church building attempting to hide. His age is debated. So early on in accounts of the Alamo, he was talked about like he was a kid. But of course, eventually folks were able to find out more about him, who he was. It may be a case of a name being misapplied. The way the story went for decades, even by a couple of the survivors, was that he was a teenager, and he ran into the church building and tried to hide behind Susanna Dickinson. The Mexican soldiers followed him into the room, lifted him in the air with their bayonets, running through his body, and tossed him against a wall. Another Texan, Brigito Guerrero, who was a member of a lodge in Mexico, also sought refuge in the chapel. So this is one of the Mexicans fighting on the Texas side. He had arrived with Mexican forces a couple of years earlier, as conflicts were slowly building up and getting worse, and he had gone AWOL from the Mexican army and realigned himself with the Texan forces. In the waning moments of the Alamo battle, he managed to convince the Mexican soldiers who captured him that he was actually a prisoner unwillingly inside the Alamo, so they spared his life. So he's one of the Texan soldiers who actually managed to live with a bit of trickery. By 6:30 in the morning, the battle for the Alamo was over. 1 hour had passed since Santa Anna's forces began creeping to the walls. Mexican soldiers inspected every corpse and bayoneted anybody that moved. Even with all of the Texans dead, Mexican soldiers continued to shoot, some killing each other in the confusion as they'd done from the beginning, because again, many of them were draftees, had no experience in war, and many of them didn't want to be there in the first place. Mexican generals were unable to stop the bloodlust and appealed to Santa Anna directly for help. The president did make an appearance, but is said to have not been active enough in his efforts to end the conflict. And so violence kind of continued around him until finally the buglers trumpeted a sound of retreat. Time to call things off. It was amid this awful carnage in those last moments that the incredible story of Susanna Dickinson's survival, which I already mentioned, took place. And so when I was asked to talk about Freemasons in the Alamo, this story is what pops into my mind. I can tell you that's not necessarily the story that'll pop into a lot of Texas Masons' mind or Texans' mind, because it's not the glorious Texas kind of popular tale that we love, but it is a story that should be loved, as it's an example of Freemasonry extending across the divisions of a major conflict. And so here's the details. Susanna Dickinson and her husband, brother Alamo Dickinson, the one with the cannon that he was running around with, firing into the barracks and everywhere else, trying to stop the Mexican forces, they were friends with the Musquiz family. The Musquiz family is often not even mentioned in stories of the Alamo, but the patriarch of the family, Ramon Musquiz, was the mayor of San Antonio, effectively, under the Mexican government. And he was a Mexican Freemason who had unsuccessfully tried to get the Grand Lodge in Mexico to charter lodges in Texas a decade earlier, right? So that's an undercurrent of the whole Texas Revolution, that there were Mason settlers living in Texas wanting to practice Freemasonry. And in the 1820s, they applied to a Grand Lodge in Mexico. And the official story on this side of the border is that they never heard an answer, which they took as a rejection. Well, Musquiz, the Mexican mayor of San Antonio, had put his energy behind support for that effort 10 years earlier. During the siege of the Alamo, Brother Musquiz, as the mayor of San Antonio, entered President Santa Anna's military tent and begged the president to inform his officers that a woman with a baby by the name of Dickinson, a friend of his, would be found inside the Alamo and should be spared from trouble. Meanwhile, inside the walls, Brother Dickinson realized that all would soon be over. He told his wife to hide with the other wives inside the chapel with his Masonic apron covering their baby in her arms, a 15-year-old baby. He strictly told her to keep the apron visible. No matter what happens, you keep this apron over our child. So there she was with an apron shielding the baby when young Jacob Walker ran into the chapel trying to hide and was killed by bayonet right in front of her. Moments later, Mexican General Manuel Castrillon of Victoria Sobre Sempola Lodge number 87 in Mexico burst into the room and asked the screaming crowd, "Is there a Mrs. Dickinson here?" After she stepped forward, some Mexican soldiers violently grabbed her, but Brother Castrillon called them off and explained, quote, "Leave her alone. The general has specifically asked me to find her," end quote. While following him to Santa Anna's tent, a stray bullet struck her in her right calf muscle. And so Brother Almonte, who I mentioned earlier, ran to her, picked her up, and carried her the rest of the way to the tent. The wound was tended to in Santa Anna's personal tent, and it is unclear if the Masonic apron or some other reason inspired the president. But whatever the reason was, he offered to adopt the child and educate the child, raising her as one of his own. A pretty remarkable offer from the president of a new nation and victor of a war regarding the child of a man who had he had just slain in battle. Susanna is said to have declined on account of preferring to see her child starve to death than be given, quote, into the hands of the author of so much horror, end quote. She and the baby arrived in the city of Gonzales a week later, among a few survivors ready to tell the rest of Texas about the legendary terrors they had witnessed. Accounts vary regarding the final moments of American hero, our brother Davy Crockett. Either he surrendered and was executed, or, as one man who was there that day later swore, Crockett's lifeless body was found by the Mexican soldiers and commanding officers, surrounded by more than 15 Mexican soldiers he'd apparently killed in hand-to-hand combat. An end truly in line with the amazing stories from throughout his life across the West, both true and false, the many stories. A final extraordinary tale of a man with an incredible will to survive against all odds. In total, by the end of the siege and concluding battle, about 600 Mexicans were killed or severely wounded, and effectively all 250 Texans perished. The Mexicans were buried in the local cemetery. The Texans were stacked up and burned to ashes. 1 year later, and after the story of the Alamo had inspired the rest of Texas to successfully fight for its independence, Brother Juan Seguin led a funeral service after gathering up the ash pile and depositing it into a coffin with the names of the Alamo leaders etched into the coffin. He gave a speech that included, quote, "The spirit of liberty appears to be looking down from its elevated throne, saying, 'Behold your brothers, Crockett, Bowie, Travis. They preferred to die 1,000 times rather than submit themselves to the tyrant's yoke. Their sacrifices are worthy of inclusion in the pages of history. What a brilliant example for others that we have to follow,'" end quote. In the aftermath of the battle, Brother Sam Houston used the memory of what happened at the Alamo to inspire Texas forces in a successful responsive effort that did lead to Texas independence and the successful capture of Brother Santa Anna as a prisoner. Myths abound that Santa Anna's life was spared because he gave the Masonic grand hailing sign of distress. Perhaps you've heard that story before, but primary records clearly show that that was not the case. Instead, he was spared because his signature on an independence document recognizes Texas as its own republic. And the example of mercy by sparing him was believed to be a smart diplomatic move to help establish Texas as an independent and civilized republic in the eyes of the world. In fact, many myths and facts continue to be shared, fought over, and inspiring to Texans and Americans today. The battle effectively sits in our minds like a modern Thermopylae as an example of the brave commitment of an outnumbered group of men desirous of achieving their ideals of liberty and democracy. And that's about the end of what I have for you, except I would say of special note for today's consideration, because of where you guys are, is a ceremony of remembrance that took place 11 years ago, at which a monument was unveiled in remembrance of the 4 Scotsmen who were themselves among the Texan defenders and died at the Alamo. They were John McGregor, Richard Ballantyne, or Ballantine, I'm sure one of you will tell me the right way to say that name, Isaac Robinson, and David Wilson, who were there confronting the 3,000 strong Mexican army. There has been some evidence that 2 of these men were Masons, but there is not yet enough to say it for sure. And regardless, their presence that day is evidence enough that a spirit of camaraderie existed between Texas and Scotland, even when Texas was still fighting for the right to existence. And that's the Freemasons at the Alamo.
Brother Robert Marshall, thank you so much for giving us that deeply enlightening presentation, particularly coming from you as a Texan. I think it really brought to life what we probably all know as the John Wayne movie, the Richard Whitmark and the Richard Boone movie, and how Hollywood treated it. But the stories that you were able to share with us there were really fascinating, and the Masonic connections, I think, is really what this lockdown series is about during our COVID pandemic, just bringing stories around the world that we can contemplate on. So thank you so much for that. As you would expect, there are a good few questions and comments in the chat box for you, so I'll read them out to you, Robert, and the various comments, and we can see if we can get some answers from you. There's a lot of greetings that I'll send on to you later on this evening by email. A nice little song of the Alamo at this link on YouTube. This is a particularly fine rendition by an Irish folk group from many years ago now, and that's courtesy of Ian Anderson at South Queensferry. Thank you, Ian. Colin Clark. And at this stage, could I say a personal thanks to Colin Clark, member of Holland Lodge Number 1. He's an ex-Pat jock over there, and he is who found you for me, Robert. So, Colin, thank you for your services, bringing Robert to us this evening. And Colin mentions that many of the canons were from Falkirk, just along the road, and we've got a few brethren here from that neck of the woods on the call this evening. Right, so Paul still alive. Paul, I hope you're doing well. Paul's in hospital fighting COVID just now, and he's changed his name from Gorgeous Paul to Paul Still Alive. Just so, Paul, we're glad that you're still alive, and we hope that your battle against COVID goes from strength to strength and you put the little disease down. But he asked, what about James Bowie? It's my understanding he led some troops at the Alamo for a short period alongside Travis.
Yep, and that is correct. So Jim Bowie was one of the first guys, one of the earlier guys I talked about in there, who was 40 years old. He was an experienced soldier and experienced leader in general, and he is the one who fell ill with tuberculosis and collapsed as things were really getting underway. If I remember right, I sometimes get it mixed up which was which, but I think it was Bowie was officially in charge of the volunteers in the Alamo, and Travis was officially in charge of the regular soldiers, the professionals, although there really wasn't a whole lot of experience or skill separating the two. And when Bowie collapsed due to tuberculosis, that's when Travis assumed command of both kinds of defenders.
There's Ian Kennedy puts a lovely anecdote in. It's a story I've heard in the past, Robert, and maybe you'll be able to clear it up for us, proud Scots. There is an anecdote that as the Mexican army band struck up, the Scots amongst the Texans responded singing "Green Grow the Rashes O," and I won't sing it for the brethren. They have enough listening to me without me singing to them, which being misheard, leading the defenders to be called Gringos or Gringos. Any truth behind this, do you think?
So first, I'll say I've been called Gringo many times. I do live close enough to the Mexican border that I've got a lot of Mexican friends, and it is still a common thing to call white folks here. I'll also say that I've often been told by Mexicans who use the term that it has to do with the color of eyes that we have, like green eyes or blue eyes. And so like even Mexicans who have blue eyes or green eyes are often called gringos, even though they're not white. However, I'll tell you, I always thought that explanation for the word, I'm an etymologist. I actually study words. It's something I'm very much into. I have not looked into that one. I've also not heard this really, really wonderful anecdote that I'm going to have a lot of fun digging into. I'll tell you, I hope that I can find some kind of early sign that this has credence to it. Thanks for sharing.
Colin Clark, your brother from Scottish brother living in Texas, comments wrong war. It was later in the Spanish-American War, the terms gringo and redneck both refer to Scots roots. So it is to do with us, but as we all say, every American's got a Scottish granny anyway, so.
That one makes sense. I could definitely see that happening in the Spanish-American War, more likely than the Alamo. But regardless, that's really fascinating. Thank you all for sharing that.
Okay. Michael Monroe, our friend in Paris, as many of us know the story of the Alamo from the John Wayne film, how does the film correspond to reality?
I think my answer to you guys might be a little different than what it would be if I was asked the same thing in a Texas lodge, mostly just because I'd like to leave the Texas lodge under my own volition. But, so the film came on the tail end of the centennial of Texas Revolution, Texas independence. And so there was a lot of pride and romanticism built around the Alamo at the time. There still is today. And so the film was as much a portrayal of the romantic ideas of Texas independence as it was of real life, maybe even more so. There are some major inaccuracies in it, but there was also some effort at accuracy as well. I think I haven't seen that one since I was a kid, but I think that's the one that might end with Davy Crockett playing music at the end, or maybe that's a different one. There's no real reason to believe that has any basis in fact. As I said earlier, he seems to have either died fighting or surrendered and was executed, but there's nothing in the early records to suggest that he was playing music. But it's not necessarily impossible either. As far as direct comparisons, things to just point out from the movie that are inaccurate, I couldn't do that off the top of my head. But I can tell you that if I saw the film, I would almost guarantee I would see some inaccuracies that I would recognize as not being unique or original to the film. So what you see, a lot of what you see in the film come from things like one of the very first original plays written related to Texas was about the Battle of the Alamo. And so it was this fictional stage production of what happened. And it was very popular to read, not necessarily perform, but to read among Texans. And it made its way into a Texas history book, usually referred to these days as Pennybackers, which was the go-to book of Texas history in schools in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And that thing is just, there's a copy of it up here above me. It is just ridden with completely made up stuff. But they made an effort in that film to be accurate. They just didn't have the tools that we have available today to comb through what was and what wasn't true.
Okay, Robert, I think we can understand that. There's a film about Scotland called Braveheart that has a lot of inaccuracies around it as well. So I can see some of the Bren laughing there at me with that comment. One of the Bren who is a regular every week with us and is one of the chief bantermeisters, it's Alistair Marshall, and he goes, I knew anything by a marshal would be good, but he apologises for leaving early. And he was the one that had his COVID jag this afternoon, and he's saying he's getting some side effects from tonight's COVID jag. So he feels he needs to be nice to them all, and he hopes it wears off all. And he says, well done to you. So another comment, all subsequent presidents of the Republic of Texas were Freemasons.
That is correct. In fact, something I didn't mention that I should have, again, because of who the audience is, Sam Houston, his family background comes from the clan Wishton. Wishton made its way into being pronounced as Houston in his family line. And we actually had, here at my lodge, where I am currently, a reunion of the American descendants of Clan Wishton here just a couple of years ago. So that's something they take a lot of pride in.
That's great. Sandy Thompson comments that the cannons came from the Carron Ironworks, Falkirk in Scotland, and we do have a Lodge Carron, and we do have members visit us from that as well. I really enjoyed the presentation. We'd like to hear some of your other presentations. That's something we can talk about offline. Robert, if you would like to come back and join us in the future, because we'll be conducting these until we get back to Freemasonry in a normal sort of environment. Thank you very much. Alan Moore, I've had the pleasure and privilege of visiting the Alamo twice. Very humbling indeed. Thank you, brother. Just quickly scroll down. Do we know how many of the Mexican soldiers were Masons then?
So that's an interesting thing that I'll tell you. You guys are all about to become, at least on this particular thing, much more knowledgeable about the Masonic elements of the Texas Revolution or Battle of Alamo than most Texas Masons are. Don't get me wrong, I think I've kind of criticized my people here a couple of times. I love Texas Masonry, I love Texas Masons, but we are prone to myths being treated as fact. And so what I'll say is, first of all, no, we don't know how many Mexican soldiers were Masons. There were somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 Mexican soldiers there that day. But what I will say is that we do know a lot of them were. And I'm actively working on trying to identify, which lodge, how active were they, this kind of thing. I'm working with a Mexican historian right now to do some of this tracking. And just to give you an idea proportionally of how many may have been soldiers is, I can tell you that so again, this is Texas splitting off from Mexico as an independent republic. Prior to that, nearly all of the land in Texas was owned by Mexican citizens. And the number we're zeroing in on right now is somewhere around 70 to 80% of the landowners were Masons. 70 to 80%, Texas is huge. 70 to 80% were Mexican Freemasons. And especially in terms of officers, you're going to have mostly Masons in the Mexican Army at that time. And I alluded to early on in this presentation that Freemasonry had become a very politically charged thing in Mexico at that time, where you had the two major political parties as the Yorks and the Scottish. Santa Anna, being an active Mason himself, as we often see throughout history, when you have an active Mason who's in charge of military forces, it seems to be that they're very comfortable, or more comfortable, appointing brothers to command portions of their forces. And almost without fail, all of the Mexican leaders at the Battle of Alamo were Masons.
Okay, thank you. Paul's still breathing up in the hospital, and he's got another question for us. What size was the fort, the Alamo, compared to a soccer field?
Okay, so thanks for calling it soccer. That was kind of you. So I'm not very familiar with the sport, but
or one of your football fields, comparable.
Okay, yeah. So the Alamo grounds were about 2 acres, and I would guess a football field is pretty similar. I think they're actually that was a fun way to ask the question, because I think they were almost the exact same size. That in ways, if you go in person, like somebody mentioned they have, and could maybe validate, it's both bigger and smaller than you expect the more you know about the battle. But the grounds themselves were much larger than what is typically thought of as the Alamo, or even what is viewed as the Alamo by the millions of tourists who go there every year. Yeah. And that's because a lot of it got kind of built around and commercialized, and there are currently active efforts to actually undo that and restore the whole grounds to what they were. But where the battle happened, where they were fortified and trying to defend, about the size of a football or a soccer field is a perfect way to think about it.
Yeah, I would agree with you about the building round it. I visited San Antonio and visited the Alamo, and I spent a couple of weeks there with work, and you just come across it, and I think it's like the pyramids in Egypt. You look behind you and you're in the middle of Cairo, sort of thing. It's just there. You see, Chaz Black's asking a question. What was the Masonic influence in Mexico? Was it Scottish, Irish, or English? What was the origin of the Masonry there?
Well, both. And you know, as you get with the modern's ancient schism and or during the American Revolution, how you see a shift occur in the colony/states where they were shifting away from very English elitist masonry towards a more common folk Scotch-Irish flavor of masonry. The same kind of thing had happened in Mexico as in the early 1820s when Mexico acquired independence, and there's this power struggle among the factions of what kind of government are we going to have and what direction are we going to take things, how are we going to stay in control of our territories. That question affected the types of masonry that were thriving in various parts of Mexico, so that you get one version that leans more royalist and one that leans more democratic, and it generally falls along the same lines. So they're all there. They're both there. Okay. I couldn't tell you which one there was more of. They're constantly battling each other and taking over.
Okay, thank you. I've got one more question and then a comment to round off the question and answer session for you. And Brother Ian Waugh says, you spoke about myths. Is there a myth surrounding Bowie's blade? Is it not supposed to have disappeared after the Alamo?
So yeah, as far as I know, nobody knows what happened to it. But the myths surrounding it, I'm not particularly familiar with.
Okay.
Yeah.
No worries. And I think just to round this section off is a comment from Howard Sunderland. Great presentation by Robert. On a band of men and masons dying for a strong belief. Good on them. Honourable men. And with that comment, Robert, on behalf of the Lodge Hope of Karachi and all our visitors at our lockdown lecture series, can I thank you, sir, for the time and trouble that you've come along this evening to present to us the story of the Alamo, and probably the true version, the true story, not the Hollywood version of the Alamo, and highlighting some of those Masonic brethren that were involved on both sides, and in particularly the story of Susanna Dickinson and the baby. I think everyone here would have very much appreciated that. The conversation does carry on, Robert, on the Facebook pages, and I'm glad that you joined us this afternoon, and you'll see a variety of things that I'll post later on about your presentation, and the brethren always get involved in that. So thank you once again. Bren, as usual, before I open the speakers up so you can say your personal thank yous to Robert, next week we will be joined by another American brother, Brother Patrick Craddock. Many of you know Patrick. He was over at the Grand Master Masons installation last year. He's a good friend of Jim Jack, who Robert mentioned earlier, and he's going to talk to us about the history of the craftsman's apron. And that is the business that Patrick's now in, and he's got a Welsh background, and if you follow him on Facebook, Brian, there's lots of entertaining little ditties about him craddocking around the place, as he likes to call it. So we look forward to joining you then. Many of you have also asked me about Brother Mark Smith from the Antiques Roadshow. Will he be coming back to give his second part of his Victoria Cross presentation, Hearts of Oak? Well, Bern, he's got a busy filming schedule coming up with the Antiques Roadshow, but he has confirmed to me yesterday evening that he will come and join us on the 20th of July. So that's a forewarning for you, Bern, because that was a sellout that Brother Mark Smith will be here on the 20th of July to present Hearts of Oak. So, Brian, with that in mind, please unmute yourself and say your thank yous to our fantastic speaker this evening, Brother Robert Marshall, all the way from Texas. Thank you, Brian.
Well done,
Thank you,
Robert.
Robert.
Thank you very much, Robert.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert.
Good stuff there, Robert. Very well done.
Thank you, Robert.
Very
Appreciate it,
entertaining.
Robert,
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Good.
Thank you, Brother Robert. Great presentation. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Well done.
Robert.
Thank you very much, Robert.
Good night, brethren.
Thank you. Most enjoyable all.
Good night. Leaving you now.
Right. Thank you very much, Robert. Very interesting, very informative. Well done.
Thank you, Robert. Really enjoyed that. Very enlightening. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert.
Robert, that was a superb Masonic adventure through the Alamo. Thank you so very much.
Thank you,
Brother Robert. And a very impressive beard, I might add.
Jelly will get you everywhere, Sandy.
Thank you very much, Robert. I appreciate it.
Thoroughly enjoyable. And good night to everybody. See you all
Cheers,
again.
Archie.
Good
Thank
night.
you.
Thank you, everyone.
As usual, Brian, I'll give you
Fantastic
5.
presentation, Robert. Thank you for your talk.
Well done, Robert. Fantastic. Thank you.
And 4, brethren.
Thank you very much, Robert, and for you, Gordon, for organising it all.
Cheers,
Thank you.
Brian.
Thank you.
And
Gordon.
3, Brian.
Absolutely.
And 2. And 1, Brian.
Very good night.
And thank you once again, Robert,
Thank
on
you.
behalf of everyone at the Lodge Hope of Karachi.